Well, let's talk more then about Antony Blinken's visit to Africa. He was in South Africa, as I was saying, from the weekend. He then held those meetings with the International Relations Minister Naledi Pandor. Now, in that meeting, Antony Blinken said that the United States would not dictate to Africa which decisions to make and which side to take, especially when you look at the geopolitical issues in the world at the moment. Let's talk about this with Lebohang Pheko, a political economist. A very good afternoon to you, Ms. Pheko. Welcome to the program. So the Americans, according to Antony Blinken, want an equal relationship with Africa. How much of a departure would that be from previous positions?
Actually, the U.S. foreign relation is actually quite consistent, Megile, and I think even between the Democrats and the Republicans, there's very little that lies between them. What has driven those relations and really given them fuel over the last few administrations is more the personalities that drive them. So under, for example, President Clinton, there was much greater emphasis on peace building and economic diplomacy. Under Bush II, George W. Bush, he was much more interested in economic health, for example, and the public health care system, and parts of the social reproductive and maternity reproductive rights, which of course are being turned on their head now. Under President Obama, there was a purely mercantilist approach, which was about, remember, the skirmishes around the AGOA, our American chickens being imposed on us and so forth. And I think what we've seen under the former President Trump was that, the African continent was basically a black hole. It was completely neglected. Mm-hmm. And in fact, what's quite interesting about this particular visit is that it comes at a time when there's the capacity for U.S. embassies across the continent is severely hampered. So most of the embassies in the key countries, including Rwanda, including South Africa, which, by the way, was without an ambassador for about a year and a half into the Trump administration. So there's a lot of recovery to be done. So they're chronically understaffed. So it's not only as the symbolic neglect and the benign and the disrespectful comments made by the former president, but how that has administratively really hampered the extent to which U.S. relations on the continent can be executed. But the actual relations and the actual policy has been pretty much the same. Peacekeeping, very fuzzy noises on economic relations, a lot of bilateralism within and between countries, the whole notion of stating that they are into governance and that they agree with sovereignty, whilst, of course, oftentimes showing themselves to have preferential candidates, which is quite difficult and problematic. But the actual policies are fairly similar. And
International Relations Minister Naledi Pandor at that briefing said on Monday that she would not be bullied or dictated to by the United States or anyone else. She then said that she had not received that sort of treatment from Blinken. How well have we as South Africa asserted ourselves as far as a sovereign state that will make its own decisions, even when we are in a room with a wealthy country such as the Americans?
So I think that's an important point. It's important for us to situate ourselves and see ourselves as the world sees us. So even though we have our own issues in South Africa, we are still viewed, particularly by the U.S., by the European Union, as a pillar state, and we certainly still are. And I think that we have to appreciate that there's nothing coincidental, of course, in this visit, and that the countries that are being visited on the continent are extremely key strategic poles. Remember that, of course, this comes at a time when many countries, especially the U.S. And the Ukraine and some parts of the EU, have been quite critical of our independent role, and many other countries' independent role in the Ukraine-Russian conflict, for example. And I think that 10, 20 years ago, it would almost have been unthinkable for an African country or a majority world country, as I prefer to say, to possibly say that as bluntly as Minister Naledi Pandor said it. And I think that also illustrates a much greater assertiveness on our part, and also I think an understanding that the balance of powers and the balance of forces has shifted, Tembegile. So, for example, this comes at a time when the U.S. is scrambling quite desperately to reignite their own hegemony and their own relationships on the continent, because the competing powers of China and Russia pose a real threat, if one may put it that way, but a real threat to the kind of relationship that they have always played, which is so-called friend of Africa, although not always a very friendly friend.
And let me ask you about that question, because it came up again, and Blinken said it wasn't true that his visit to South Africa, the DRC, as well, is part of that race for influence in Africa against the Chinese and the Russians. But is it entirely honest when you consider, for example, that the Russians are pouring more money into the continent and the Chinese are also making significant moves?
In fact, the Russians are quite peripheral in terms of the money that they pour in, but certainly you're quite right. I mean, China is the biggest single trader and the single investor on the African continent as it speaks. And I think what Russia is trying to do and have been trying to utilize and maximize during this Ukraine-Russian conflict is to remind the African continent that they've always been friends of the continent, that they stood with the continent during the colonial battles, during anti-imperialism, that they don't have a colonial footprint on the continent, that they have never tried to destabilize any countries and sovereignty, unlike the U.S., Gaddafi, Lumumba, Sankara. We can list the names of heads of state who were sovereignly elected on the African continent, who were removed, certainly with the complicity of the U.S. state or the CIA or whatever organ it may be. So it certainly comes at a time when they are thinking through their own rivalries, and also they are thinking through their own rivalry with China, which is, by the way, depending on which index we use. So there's several. Not only have they grown the economy from 1.2 trillion 20 years ago to about 17 trillion today. I mean, that's an exponential leap. They have also increased the extent of the aid and the funding that they provide. The other thing is that even though 60% of foreign exchange reserves are still held in US dollars, that's an amount that's diminishing. And I think China has been one of the countries which has been saying for a long time that we have to have a mixed bag, a mixed bag of different currencies, by which we should set the world economy, especially oil prices. And lastly, to say that other than the U.S., the largest level of U.S. dollar reserves are held by China. So when we look at consumer price purchasing power, the largest economy for the last 7 or 8 years has in fact by China. So I think that we need to be even careful when we say that the U.S. is the largest economy, because it depends on which kind of indices. So the U.S. are aware that they are an empire which is diminished.
And you're right about the Russians, because even Minister Naledi Pandor did make the point that when you look at the $20 billion from the U.S. and the $4 billion from Russia, it's not money that's driving the Russia relationship specifically. But for now, Lebohang Pheko, political economist, thank you for your time.